The culture wars are over. That's right. The culture wars are over. It's time for a radical economic agenda. Now, a lot of people in this country are relatively happy the LP has been re-elected with an increased majority, at least in the House of Representatives. Now, what this election highlighted was the fact that you cannot use the culture wars to gain parliamentary power. The culture wars, and to a lesser extent, identity politics, have always been at the margins and fringes of Australian society. And this election loss by the Liberal Party, and it is a significant election loss, highlights this is not a way forward for what is described as the Freedom Free Enterprise Party. Now, when I campaigned in Flinders, and once again I'd like to thank all the people who cast their ballot for me, about 1% of the electorate, I ran on a radical economic agenda. Irrespective of what the Labor Party promises, they cannot deliver on their promises without radical economic change. That's one lesson which hasn't been grasped by the electorate. I think by changing or reinforcing the power of the government of the day, that somehow they will ultimately benefit as far as housing availability is concerned, as far as education is concerned, as far as infrastructure is concerned, as far as access to healthcare is concerned. The fact is, the Labor Party's election victory, and let's not forget, just over 1/3 of Australians voted directly for the Labor Party, and its victory was built on preferences. Its victory was built on the promise that they could institute reforms within the current economic vortex, within the current economic climate, within the current economic structure, which over the past 50 years has highlighted that deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation have only benefited a minuscule part of the community. It's one thing to say that somebody may have access to housing, but when that access is determined by 40 to 50-year mortgages, that's not freedom. Far from it. So what I said in the Flinders election campaign was the fact that we need to move forward beyond the culture wars, beyond identity politics, to a radical economic agenda. Now, this is not revolutionary stuff. These are simple, basic reforms that can be carried out in a parliamentary democracy if the governments have the strength and courage to do so. There is nothing radical about a social security net. There is nothing radical about a universal basic income. There's nothing radical about free education at all sectors of education. There is nothing radical about access to basic and sophisticated healthcare for all people in this country. There's nothing radical about ensuring that everybody has access to food, has personal security. There's nothing radical about any of this. But in order to obtain these basic necessities, we need radical economic change. Now, radical economic change doesn't come because you and I suggest it. It comes when people begin to realise that marching behind the same drummer, irrespective of the colour of that drummer, whether it's red or blue or green or yellow, the fact is that we need to change the drumbeat. If you march to the same drumbeat, nothing changes. And although the Labor Party has achieved an extraordinary electoral victory in the House of Representatives, the fact is there's nothing in their agenda currently to make those necessary changes. And those changes are critical. And if there's one thing, as I said at the beginning, that this election highlights is that the culture wars are over. The time for identity politics is over. The time for hatred and division as a mobilising electoral force in this country is over. If people want to continue having a parliamentary system, then the forces of hate and division will now begin to work in an extra-parliamentary fashion and use direct action, as we're increasingly seeing, to impose their will on people, their jaundiced, myopic views of what society should be like. So radical economic transformation, change, is what you and I should be aiming for. And that means putting these ideas out in the community. Currently, there is a hiatus where people sigh, have a sigh of relief. They think, oh, the more difficult, the more divisive, the more hateful aspects of the Liberal Party are now no longer in a position to dictate policy. But the fact is, these elements in society have not gone away. The 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication have not gone away. The commentators who support the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange have not gone away. The problems have not gone away. The election victory does not mean that one less child lives in poverty in this country. The election victory of the Labor Party does not mean that people have roofs over their head. The number of people having difficulty meeting their financial commitments decreases. Obviously, there's a period of grace where people have voted for a system which looks after not only their needs physically, but their security needs. A security based not on, marching to the drums of war, but security based on forming alliances with the communities, the countries, the sovereign nation states around us, agreeing to disagree, but agreeing to encourage security in the region. So we are at a period of immense potential. immense potential. For far too long, the culture wars have dominated thinking in this country. The wars about climate change have dominated thinking and stopped us moving forward. Now that these issues have become marginal issues for the tin hat brigade, for those elements in society who want to move backwards constantly to some idyllic lifestyle that never existed, the fact is that we are at a juncture of change. And that juncture of change, in what direction we move, ultimately depends on what governments can deliver. Because people have said, we expect our representatives to deliver to us, not to deliver to the culture warriors or those involved in identity politics, but to deliver to the great mass of the community, the sections of the community that have been ignored, marginalised, ostracised to such an extent that a significant number of people in this country no longer feel that they are part of this country, no longer feel that this country cares about them. It's one thing to talk about kindness and empathy. It's another thing to create these circumstances, these social, cultural, political circumstances where kindness and empathy no longer needs to be a significant issue in society, because we've resolved the issues that face us. As I keep saying, we are 27 million people living on a resource-rich continent. For far too long, we have allowed the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication to determine our future. A few simple steps we can take as a country. The first one is to diversify the economy by introducing more public infrastructure, more public services, by introducing a collective and cooperative segment to the Australian community funded by a 1% levy on superannuation contributions, which are basically stored in the world stock markets. And as we can see, the volatility of a private investment for private profit dominated economy can actually mean that people's savings for their old age disappear overnight. So we need to diversify the economy. We need to look at taxation revenue. We need to look at a financial transaction tax. We need to look at taxes on stocks and shares. Just those two things, a 1% financial tax and a tax on stocks and shares, would pay for a universal basic income. Simple measures. And most importantly of all, we need to look at our natural resource base. We have manna under the ground, not lying on the treetops, but under the ground. Not beneath the trees, but under the ground. This is an extraordinarily rich country in terms of the resources which can be used internally and exported. The fact that we receive such little in return by allowing unaccountable corporations to extract these resources, paying minimal taxation and laughing at us because of our stupidity to allow this to occur. It's a little bit like finding a gold nugget, a 5 kilogram gold nugget on the street, and you pick it up and you give it to the richest member of the community. It's similar. There's nothing different. Here we have resources, a commonwealth, which belong to First Nations people and the rest of us. And we dig up those resources and we give it to the richest segments of society. Extraordinary. What an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in. The tragedy is that for far too long people have been involved in culture wars, identity politics, and have forgotten the main game. The main game is access to resources. It's about holding wealth in common and using it for the common good, not the individual gain. We're at a period of great potential, and that great potential is based on you and me and other people highlighting that we have moved from a period of navel gazing to a period where we are talking about accessing the commonwealth and using that commonwealth for the common good. Because what else is a sovereign nation state? Is it there to look after the interests of a minuscule minority? Is it there to sabre rattle at our neighbours? Is it there to ensure the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange, communication continue to dominate every aspect of our existence? Or is it there to serve us? Because ultimately, democracy isn't, as we've just seen in the last election a week ago, isn't casting a ballot every 3 years for a government to represent our interests, when the parliamentary agenda, even when you have a majority reformist, so-called reformist government, when the parliamentary agenda is not set by Parliament, or that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication to maintain their power and wealth. Even so, we are at this juncture of history. We can move forward or we can move backwards. And the important thing to remember is that we have the capacity, the intelligence, and possibly the will to move forwards to tackle the issues which now face us as individuals, as communities, and as citizens and residents in this country.